Okay, well, hello, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this session of our Accordance eAcademy. Um, this session is on text translation and performance using Accordance to hear the Gospels in translation. And it's being presented by Dr. Mark Vitalis Hoffman, who is Glatfelter Professor of Biblical Studies at United Lutheran Seminary. And he's got extensive parish experience in Minnesota and North Dakota, and is also co-author of the Atlas of the Bible published by Fortress Press. He's also a very active Accordance Forum member and offers quite a bit of help to other Accordance users. And for this webinar, he's got a couple of handouts available in the handout section, and a link to a forum thread that also has some additional materials you'll see in the chat. And as he goes through his presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to enter those in the question section. And if it's Accordance related and we can answer it there, we'll do that. And otherwise, we'll hold those questions until he's ready to field them. All right, so I think I covered all the bases, so I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Hoffman.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. So I'm going to turn off myself here if you're seeing me right now. And I want to, first of all, go and show you my screen. And this is one of the handouts. And just to show you a little bit what we'll be covering here today and to give a little bit of an introduction to what I'm about. What you're going to see here is a result of what's been teaching Greek for 25 years or so, and especially an interest in the Gospel of Mark. And lately I've been doing more and more with performance criticism, and that ties into the network of biblical storytellers, if any of you are familiar with that. And I teach a class nowadays, and I actually see some of my students in attendees here. That's good for them, who are taking a class with me right now on experiencing and performing the gospel. And so what we're going to see here is something that's coming out of my conviction that Mark, more than any of the other gospels, was initially presented orally. And Mark is almost, you could say, an oral transcription of what a written transcription of an oral presentation of the gospel. Now, of course, all of our New Testament was predominantly heard by people rather than read. Literacy rates were low, and so when I'm picturing communities of Christians getting together in a house church in the first century there, and they have a letter from Paul, or they have these gospels that are starting to go around, somebody who is skilled in reading and performing the text does it for the community, and so they hear it. Now, what I'm about here in this is that I have found that so many of our English translations turn them into good literary works rather than oral works. And there's the difference there that I'm making here is when you submit something in writing, you want to make sure that you not only have the spelling right, but grammar's right, complete sentences, all those kind of things. And you want it to flow smoothly. So in oral presentation, however, there are incomplete sentences, there are redundancies, there's little tricks that the presenter would use, especially if they're trying to memorize the text. And so I'm finding in Mark that it really has all sorts of oral characteristics that are obscured in a lot of translations. And so we're going to try to recover some of that oral character of it. And I hope to persuade you by the end of this what's going on. So there's a couple things then that I'm really working with here. First of all is, what about translations? We have a whole variety of translations I'll talk about in just a moment here. And this isn't to say that one translation is wrong and another is right. There are, of course, different intended audiences that you adjust your reading levels for, and there are all sorts of cultural things that go on in various translations, and so the intent is going to be different. But as I say, my translation that I'm going to show you as how I work with translating the text has this very particular interest in getting an oral sort of rendering of it. So that's one of the things I'm doing here. And then I'm also looking at especially how accordance just makes this all so much easier to do and so much more possible. So you see here a number of references and tools that I'm using as I'm working through here today. And I'm happy to demonstrate a lot of these as we go along if there's questions about it. In translating, of course, they're regularly wanting to consult lexicons. I had done an earlier webinar, and the handout will let you link on that, and that'll get you to another handout on a variety of lexicons that I recommend. There's a number of reference grammars that are available in accordance that are connected right with the text. I have a little, just sort of a lightweight reference grammar, but I'll show you how that can maybe be helpful here today in my own grammar that I have that's available in accordance. And then there's the one by Mounce, and there's one by Wallace. Those are both good ones to consult. There are a number of translation aids. The Exegetical Guide to the Greek New Testament, there's 9 volumes of that right now, and I'm waiting for accordance to get the Mark volume out, which recently came out, so I won't be able to show that today, but since they don't have the Mark one yet available, but that should be coming. Then the United Bible Society has a translator's handbook, which is really fascinating to use if you haven't looked at that. That was intended for people who are translating the Old and New Testament into new languages, and so they're very much aware of sort of cultural things that are going on and how that would affect your rendering, but they pay good attention to the sort of little details that are going on in a Greek text and lexical choices. And then there's a wonderful SIL exegetical summary series. There's 34 volumes of that. I'll show some examples of how that can be used as well here today. Then in terms of translation, I have an online list of English Bible versions that I have. It's a rather complete list. You can download that if you want. But the one thing that we're just thinking about here, first of all, right now then, as we get to these translations, is looking at the difference between between what would be called more formal or literal ones. The New American Standard Bible is pretty much intends, that's part of their intent, is to be in some sense transparent to the Greek as much as possible. Though we'll find in our text that we're looking at today that there's ways that I would think I can pick up the Greek a little better. The King James Version, I always sort of consult just simply because it is such a standard. It does tend to be a fairly literal one there, so we've got that. And then sometimes I look at the version. I'm sure my French is terrible, but that's interesting because it's a English translation of the Latin Vulgate. So seeing sometimes there you'll find some interesting things that have come to our traditions through the Vulgate by using that. There's a number of idiomatic ones that are sort of getting towards a middle group. The English Standard Version has become a standard in a lot of churches. It's still somewhat on the literal side. Especially when I'm doing Old Testament, I look at the Jewish Publication Society's Tanakh to get things from a Jewish perspective. One that, of course, is sort of a main one is the New Revised Standard Version text here that's used in a lot of churches. And then the Net Bible, which it isn't, there's sort of a mix in terms of its translations, but it has these excellent notes in it, text critical notes and translation notes that I encourage my students to look at. As we move into more idiomatic dynamic, the NIV, the 2011 version, is really nice that way. That one's a widely used one. And one that's come to, is starting to try to become more prevalent in especially Protestant churches, is the Common English Bible. And it is specifically ecumenically translated, but it's intended to replace the NRSV, which the NRSV was never really intended to be read aloud. It's intended to be in good English, but it was never really geared for hearing. And the CEB tries to overcome that. And the New Jerusalem Bible, if there's anything from a Roman Catholic, some fascinating things like what Protestant Bibles tend to most often translate as righteousness in the Pauline letters gets translated as justice in Roman Catholic versions, and that makes a difference of things. As you get more and more away from literal, you get into the New Living Translation, the TEV, the old Today's English version that had those nice line drawings. It's mostly, that's no longer being published. The CEV, the Contemporary English version, that's become the one that's basically replaced it, and those both especially are working at a lower reading level. And then you get something like the paraphrase, and I encourage my students to look at that because the Message by Eugene Peterson, he sort of claimed it was a translation, but he also realized it was a paraphrase. But he really did look closely at the Hebrew and Greek originals, and you can see when he's struggling with the text as he's trying to get those in. So those are our English Bible versions, and you'll see I'll be looking at a few of these here today to demonstrate what I'm about. And then as I'm trying to get a broader understanding of how something is translated or functioning in the Greek, I oftentimes will look into the Apostolic Fathers, the Apocryphal Acts. Philo and Josephus are very important to look at as well. And then you get into the classics literature as well here. And Accordance has some nice resources for those, and especially Philo and Josephus are have English and Greek parallels, and the Apostolic Fathers, some nice things you can check with that. Commentaries are also always helpful here. I just have a few that are recommended there. And that's basically what I wanted to do to just set things up and show you what we've got going here. And here now, let me, I'm going to go here first. I decided the way that I can get at what I'm trying to do is simply by looking at Mark 1, 9 to 13. I can demonstrate almost everything that I'm interested in by looking at these passages here. So hopefully you're seeing my screen right now with Mark 1, 9 to 13. And the difference that you're going to see that I'm at here, and if you can't see it, it's this first column. It's LTHU. That's I'm calling this project that I'm working on is Let the Hearer Understand. This is my translation in this first column. What's different about it is that it is really, as I say, geared toward an oral presentation. So I'm trying to emulate the oral characteristics of the Greek that I'll be highlighting here today. It actually then turns out to be fairly literal in many ways. But what I'm doing here today then is I'm giving as a comparison here, I've got our Greek, of course, and then my version, and then I'm going to use the King James Version here just as a sort of more literal one that many people are familiar with. Then the NRSV, that is a typical study Bible. Then the NIV, which as I said is being widely used, and then the CEB, which is with further out in that functional dynamic end. So I'm trying to get a variety of text up on the screen here. And what I would like you to do for just a moment here before I get into this is simply to listen. And so don't look at the screen here for just a moment, but just try to listen. And I'm going to read Mark 1, 9 through 13 from the NIV. And it goes like this. At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." At once the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. Okay, there's the text before you, and that's the way you probably have heard something like that as it was being read from in a church setting. I didn't try to make it too flat. I've heard some people who you can tell clearly they're anxious about reading and have read it with a certain degree of nervousness or flatness about it. But let's start working through this text and seeing what's going on in the Greek that might highlight our attention to its oral character. Now, first of all, here, there's two things that I want to just show in terms of accordance. What I've first done here right now is I just am going to focus on Mark 1, 9 to 13. So I've entered that up here in my verses, and so that's why I just have these going here. And then what I did, of course, is I added parallels here. And so then I brought these in, and of course these are always able to be arranged in any order that you want by dragging them around like that. So that's helpful. Now this is a vertical arrangement, and this is the way I'm looking at it. The other thing you can always do is you can open up, you can add it this way, or if you're using live click, you can get to the verse lookup or to the text browser. And this gives you a horizontal way of looking at the texts here. In both the vertical and the horizontal, when the text is tagged, you can see where the texts that are tagged, it'll highlight them. So this is a real nice way to sort of see what's going on in each of the versions when you look at it like this. And so I've picked out a few extra here that I had, I can display few more of them horizontally, verse by verse in the text browser. So I've got the New American Standard, King James, I brought in the ESV here, the CEB, and I also brought in the CEV at this one. As I say, I'm going to mainly work with this vertical scheme here today. And I'm going to go back and forth between my demonstration of this and one of my handouts, that's this colored one where I'm trying to bring these things to attention to you. I could do all this coloring in accordance and set up a screen, but I was drawing on work I'd been doing, and it was a little easier for now to work at it this way here. But let me go back and forth between these. And let me first just start out with the very first two words in Mark 1:9. In the Greek, it's kai ageneto. And here now you can see what is how each of these other versions have translated it. So in the King James, this is our famous "and it came to pass," okay, kai ageneto. And you hear, when you hear even that, you hear, do you notice I'm focusing on the sound, just sort of the quaintness. It sounds a little bit archaic and old this way, language, but this is keying you in that for us today, when you hear "and it came to pass," oh, this is somebody talking Bible talk right now. Okay, so that's a function that works for us today, and in a sense, we'll see in a moment how that works in the Greek as well. Now, what you can see here in the NRSV, NIV, and CEB, they don't even translate it. It's completely been omitted at this point. So I am interested then in what's going on here with this. And here, what I can do at this point is the sort of thing is I can highlight kai ageneto, and I'm going to copy that. And I can first of all look in Greek here for, oops. Excuse me a second, I got to put quotation marks around that here. And I can see how often and where it shows up. And I can pull open an analysis window here and do a little hits graph. And what I see here is there's a couple instances in Matthew. I've got these few more in Mark. It looks like Luke likes to use it, and Acts likes to use it. One instance out in 1 Thessalonians, and then Revelation likes to use it. So for one, I'm noticing right away This is kind of an odd thing that not every gospel author uses this kind of language with this. What I can also do at this point is I can highlight this and I can go up into my research. I've got the little window up here, choose Greek, and I can enter that phrase there in parentheses, and it's going to run this search. And let me maximize that window. And this is where it's just so nice and so quickly that I can see here. I'm looking at Greek texts. It's used 559 times in our Septuagint here. If you can see right here, I'm looking at 559 times. That's quite a bit. Now, all of these other ones here, these are all New Testament texts. So it's just repeating the number of times in the New Testament they're using it. But I can see it's used a few times in the Apostolic Fathers. Just for as large as the collection is in the Greek, it's classics, not used very often. And what is particularly interests me is in Philo and Josephus. In all of Josephus, which is a large body of work, only 2 times does he use that. And if I would look here closer at Philo, I would find that almost all of these times where he uses that phrase, he's quoting the Septuagint at this point. So what I've got going on here then, that I drawing a conclusion from this, is that Mark got this, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I'll have to, doesn't like what I'm doing here. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of this for a second. And I gotta go back to my other one here. I will, okay, I've got this here. Let me maximize this for us again. And I'll zoom this up. What we've got going on here then is that this phrase kai agenita is almost, it looks like and sounds like an intentional way to refer back to the Bible that the early Christians were using of the Greek Septuagint. And so it sounded, I can see from the other evidence, it sounded quaint and archaic in the Greek. And so I think it's totally reasonable for it to sound quaint and archaic in the English as well. And so that's why in my translation here, I've tried to reproduce it without using the "and it came to pass" with "and it so happened." This is my way then of trying to indicate this. And what I could also do at this point is I can look at this phrase, well, we did, and saw where it occurs in Mark, and we can see that this is also functions as a kind of way to designate a switch in setting or action in some way. That kai agenita is a switch in action. So it functions for the speaker and for the hearer as, oh, something new is happening at this point. So there's one thing that goes. Now, the next one I've got here is in those days. Now, I can see here en akainais tais hemerais. And there's something that you would notice in Greek. We lose it in English. It's almost impossible to render. But did you hear what I just said? En akainais tais hemerais. That with the Greek inflections, you hear those nice endings that give a certain euphony and rhythm to a sentence here with those ice, ice, ice endings there. I just became a rapper for a second there, I think. Ice, ice. No, that was, never mind. Anyways, again, notice what happens in these other versions here. I'll bring this sheet up again here. So I'm going to preserve it in mind. It's so it happened in those days. The King James Version keeps it. The NRSV keeps it in those days. The NIV has at that time, and the CEB has about that time. Now, the thing is, this phrase that you hear so nicely is actually a phrase that repeats a number of times in the Gospel of Mark. And I'm going to close this. There we go. So this "and in those days," the sort of thing I'm doing as I'm translating and trying to see if this is distinctive or something, the first thing I can do is I can search for the inflected form of it, and that'll give me all the times that this particular phrase shows up here. And look at there, once in Matthew, it's got it 1, 2, 3, 4 times in Mark, and 3 times in Luke. So this, it turns out, and I could do another research search on this as well, it turns out that this also is a sort of Biblish sort of way of talking. Now I can expand my search a little bit here by searching for the lexemes instead of just the inflected form here. And what I'm going to get here now is I also notice there's a few other singular forms of it, not in those days, but in that day. So all of these things are happening here and are sort of highlighting, oh yeah, I can see where an author, the author is using these, a speaker can use these, partly to make the sound connection that, oh, something here, pay attention to this. You notice it's kind of unnecessary information in some ways, but this is the one way that in an oral performance that this will come through as a marker to help both the speaker remember what section we're going into, and also to help the hearer note the transition at this point. Now, the next thing that we've got going on here is the Greek is simply awkward at this point. If I was to translate very literally here, and it happened in those days Jesus came. Now you can hear something's got to be done to make that into English at this point. You can see that the King James Version here, they added a "that" in order to make that flow a little bit more here. And that's why now I'm seeing here that these other versions simply eliminated that kai agenita part because it interrupts. It's just sort of an introductory phrase, and the grammar just doesn't work when you use that like this. What you really want to see at this point, if you were doing Greek, is that kai agenita followed by an infinitive. Now here, this is the sort of thing that also what I can do is I can say, well, let's see what happens when Matthew and Luke come along and use Mark, and they are going to, so I can do my, use my amplify there after highlighting this, and I'll use my gospel parallels along, and let me drag this over here so that it's, oops, I gotta pull it in as a little tab. There we go, and we'll pull up Mark 1:9. And if we would look closely at this, I'll show you a little bit later, what we discover is I can highlight here using, this was my little grammar, and this, I'll expand all of this for you so a little bit. All the gold words here are indicative verbs. And if you look over here in Luke, you see that he's only got the one indicative verb, the agenita at the beginning. He's used agenita de instead of kai agenita. And then he uses this chain of green infinitives here that I can highlight. And this is actually the more sophisticated way of getting into, of constructing a sentence. Mark's grammar at this point is simply inelegant, and it's grammatically awkward and rough. Luke fixes this up. Matthew fixes it up in his own way as well. I'm going to turn this off now, but that was something we can come back to check later. But this is the kind of thing that I'm going to highlight to you. And at this point, though, if you listen now, I'm going to read this first verse and hear what it sounds like. And so it happened in those days. Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, was baptized into the Jordan by John. Now, you can see right away that it sounds just fine that way. It's not good English grammar, and if you were trying to submit this to your English teacher, they would mark little red marks on there. But this is the way that it sounds very naturally, and that's what I'm trying to duplicate in my translation of this text here. Now, another thing you just might notice here in this very first one in my translation is I translated John with Yohanan. Now, this is something that certainly can be avoided because it can start sounding pretentious in a way if you start translating names differently. But one of my contentions as well here is that we are so used to, for example, Peter, James, and John, right? They all sound like proper English gentlemen, straight out of the pages of the King James Version with these lovely velvet clothes and everything like that. It is the way the King James has translated those names, and what gets obscured in those is, for one, their Jewishness of their names. John sounds like a good English name. Yohanan might remind you that it's a Jewish name, and James is actually Jacobus. It's Jacob. It's the same Jacob as the Old Testament. So I like to use that in mind in order to make that oral hearing sort of thing. And Peter, that isn't even a name in Greek. When Jesus calls Jesus Petros, that's the first time that gets used as a name for somebody. So I tend to try to pick up those names as well when I'm doing my translation here. Okay, I'm keep moving along here. I'm not seeing any questions, and David will stop me if something comes up here. But
there are a couple of questions. Somebody asked what the bold word, what's the significance of the bold words in your translation?
Yep, I'll get to that just a little bit later.
Okay, and then someone else was asking if they can get the Greek colored reader that you've set up.
Yes, the grammar can be purchased as a module, but it's out on the forum. I'll have to track that down again. I have shared just the highlighting scheme. I have shared that, and it might encourage you to get the grammar so you can make sense of it, where the grammar that I've got goes with it, explains what all those colors are. But it is built into the grammar as well here. So it's my understanding New Testament Greek, and I don't know how well you can see here, but here's all the color schemes that I've been able to pull out. So a gold is indicative when it has a box around it, as we'll see a little bit later. It means indicative historical present, reds for imperatives, pinks for subjunctives, and different conditionals and everything like that, those green infinitives. So that's that color coding scheme, and that is available. I have, and I've also shared it out on the Accordance Exchange as well. I think it's out there, but
okay.
Turn that off for now. Other questions?
And then one last question that we've got right now. You use into the Jordan and the others use in. What's the thinking behind into versus in?
Oh, perfect. That was my next topic to cover. So perfect timing on that.
All right,
okay,
good.
So I'm glad somebody noticed that. And what I'm looking at here then is the question was, why use into the Jordan here? And I'm looking over at the Greek, and the Greek here is, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. And let me pull this up here so it doesn't take up as much room. And let me expand this up again. The Greek here is ace. Now, in the Koine period, the word ace, preposition ace, and the preposition en do start to overlap. As people are learning Greek, they don't always get the distinction of it. But and especially in this particular section, I think Mark is making a distinction about ace and en. Ace usually has some sense of movement with it, and that's why it's accompanied by the accusative case, which is a case that expresses some intent of movement. En is used with the dative case, and that usually expresses location. So now you can hear, and again, this is why translations, there's variety. So when the NRSV says he was baptized by John in the Jordan, I don't know how you heard that, but you probably heard it. You pictured the Jordan River there, and Jesus is in the Jordan River. Okay, that's fine. That works. We're going to look at other instances here of the ace and the n. And in this particular ace, I think this is trying to convey this picture of he was baptized into. I'm picturing immersion at this point here. He's going into the Jordan. So what the detail that Mark is giving here is not simply location. Where was he when he was baptized? But it was actually giving more of a vivid picture of being baptized into the Jordan. So that's a great little detail that you like to notice here on these things. And we're going to come back to this again in just a moment. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, and see if you agree with me on this. As you can see here, the other translations don't agree with me. Again, it's not that they're wrong, but again, I'm trying to just be very attentive to the Greek. Now, the next thing I notice here is in verse 10 then, it starts out Kai, and I notice that the King James Version repeats that Kai, the NRSV repeats that Kai, but neither the NIV nor the CEB use that Kai, that and in there. That's one of our favorite Greek words, our first Greek word to learn there. And what's going on here? Why are they omitting that? Well, this is what is going to be, and I can do like just a quick search here. I can do a search for Kai, and I'm going to use my range here, just mark 1, 9 to 13. This is a quick way to do a range. And what I see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Kais. Now, in this short number of verses here, you hear this, and what you're going to hear is, and then this, and then he did this, and then he was baptized, and then this happened, and then this happened. Now, in English grammar, you would be corrected if you were submitting a nice literary paper, because it would sound like you're just being running on and. It's what like kids sound like, right? Young children when they talk. And we went to the store, and then we saw this, and then we bought this, and then we came home. Now, literarily, that's awkward and unnecessary. And so that's what we're seeing in these other translations. They're saying that Kai, just all those ands just sound too much. On the other hand, if you are listening to the text, those Kais are very helpful in two ways. First of all, they give sort of little breaks, is what you get there, in terms of allowing, okay, this little thing happened, little break, and this little thing happened, and so it's a nice oral way of organizing the text and trying to sort that out. The second thing that I think it works for is for the performer of the text. Now, the problem is, and I hope I'm not doing it too much, but English speakers tend to have the tendency to use right? And we did this, and you use that gives you just a little pause in your mind to think of where you're going, to get the right words, to get it expressed properly. I did read some time ago where actually has a positive function in oral communication for helping the listener make the connection there. You just heard me right there. And in Greek, I can use this Kai in order to make those pauses so that it allows the hearer to catch up, and it allows the reader to get ready for the next section. So in my translation, I am regularly going to translate those Kais. Sometimes they'll come out as a then, seems to be better, but I always will try to get those in there in order to indicate, oh, this is the Greek that has it, and this is what will be helpful for a person who is speaking it in English as well here. So there's those Kais that are going to happen all the way through here. And this is another thing we can see here. I think I did the search a little bit ago. So I can do, here I'm going to do a search for Kai or Da. Da is usually understood to be a little fancier because it's that secondary thing. And here now I can just, this is another thing that just shows me I'm translating Mark correctly here. If I go to my analysis graph here, and maybe it'll be easier to see by using lines here. What I've got here as I look at this is I can see these red things are the des, and the blue things are the chis. And if you notice here, they're sort of roughly equal, the amount of them in terms of proportion in Matthew. But all of a sudden, when I go to Mark here, do you notice all these chis that are happening right here? And he has so few des, right? And then when I get back to Luke, I've got, there's my chis, there's my des are much more equal, and John equals them out much more as well here too. So what I'm also finding at this point then is that this is very typical of Markan speech here, and is one more of those reasons why I think that Mark is intended as a oral communication rather than as a literary one. Okay, so I'm going to keep all those chis. And then I get to the word elthus. Now, some of you, if you've studied the Gospel of Mark, know that elthus is a key marker in the Gospel of Mark. Now, again, I can do a quick search for this in Mark. Matthew uses it a number of times. I can pull up my, this one, I can just pull up a hits graph. And you can see here, Matthew uses it a few times in here. No times really in Luke, just a handful, some in John. Acts has a few here, but here's my Gospel of Mark. It's one of Mark's favorite words. And if I were to just expand here and look in Mark, we can see that he uses this Mark, the elthus, especially at the beginning, and then things sort of slow down. He uses it less often. This is a oral way of creating pace in the text. So when you have things and immediately, and immediately, and immediately, you just feel the urgency of it. And what happens here in the Gospel of Mark, remember our first 10 chapters are going to cover all of Jesus's ministry, and the last 4 chapters are going to be his last week. So time gets greatly compressed in the last chapters of Mark, and that use of elthus is a characteristic of it. So when I find something like this, again, what I'm trying to do is reproduce that in the Greek, in my English. And what I do is I'm going to use immediately, and oftentimes you'll hear me at the end when I perform it, I'll even snap my fingers. So, and immediately, I've heard another performer, he likes to use boom, and boom, as he was ascending from the water. That's another way of getting it. It's a strong, powerful word. And what bothers me a little bit then is if you see here, the King James Version used straightway. Okay, that works. NRSV simply translates with just, and the NIV translates with just as, and the CEB simply omits it. They don't capture that at all. The next thing that I would do at this point here, and noting when I've noted all those instances that it's used in Mark, I want to translate it the same way as much as possible throughout to catch it. And that's one of the things you would note here if we would search for how the NRSV translates that elthus. You would see that it translates it in a variety of ways each time. It doesn't always do it. Sometimes it omits it altogether. The NIV doesn't always translate it either. And in that way, you miss the oral connection that Mark is making here, because we're going to get it again right down here in verse 12, where Mark once again goes, and immediately. And this then becomes this connector between verse 10 and verse 12, that these two stories, the baptism and the Jesus out in the wilderness story, are going to be connected together. And so there's why I've got immediately in both of them. And notice here the King James Version uses straightway in one and immediate in the other. They said the NRSV uses just and then they use immediately. The NIV uses just as, and then down here it uses at once. Here they didn't use it at all, and here they use at once. So that inconsistency that you see in the other translations obscures what is a nice connection in the Greek. And kai elthos And so for me, that's an oral kind of characteristic that I'm going to try to pick up in my translation as well here. Okay, the next thing that I want to bring here, so Jesus, and immediately as he was ascending from the waters, he's on a bino, which is going to, well, I'll come back to that. As he's ascending from the waters, he saw this schizomenus. Okay, you get schizophrenia, schism comes from this word right here. It's a very distinctive word in the Greek. And it's interesting here. Now, this is that kind of word. For one, I'd want to look it up in my lexicons and see what is going on with it. And so here I can use, I've got my live click going, and I can click on that schizomenos, and oh, here's my lexicons here, and I can see the different things. And I recognize that it's a strong verb for ripping and tearing apart. And it's a unique enough word that this is the kind of word I'd like to look up and see where else that word is used. And what's so fascinating here at this point is the other time it's used in Mark is in Mark 15:38. And I can add my, I'll add the NRSV here. This is at the crucifixion scene in the Gospel of Mark. And remember there, the curtain of the temple was torn into two, from top to bottom, from above to below. And here I've got these anos and kato forms here. Josephus tells us that what was on the temple of the curtain temple curtain was a depiction of the heavens. And we're going to have this voice that's going to come of the centurion saying, truly, this was God's son. For me, this is a strong oral marker that Mark is using to connect the baptism of Jesus with the crucifixion of Jesus to frame his whole gospel. That what started with the baptism is now finding its culmination here in the crucifixion, and that very distinctive word is being used to draw those two things together. So then again, this would be the sort of thing that I would want to make sure I use the exact same word at both of those locations here. So here then I've got that he's ascending from the water when he sees the heavens being opened. And here's just a little detail. Here it is a plural at this point. How do you translate it? Notice the King James says the heavens, the NRSV says the heavens, and then the NIV and CEB say heaven. So is there a difference in our mind between the heavens and heaven being opened? It doesn't seem that they're 100% consistent in doing this in the Gospels, but I'm trying to preserve, because Mark does use singular and plural, and my sense is if he uses singular and plural, he might have something in mind that I need to decide. So I'm going to try to preserve that. So here then, he sees the heavens being opened and the pneuma, the spirit, like a peristeron, which is really just a pigeon, but that sort of loses the glamour of it if it's a pigeon instead of a dove. So a dove descending, and here now I notice this nice little thing here that if you don't capture it in English, but he anabinos from the water, and the spirit is katabinoing. These words here to go, so ascending and descending. And here, again, this can be, what do I want to say here? Obscured in the English versions when they use coming up and descending. Now here the CEB did use coming up and coming down. I was using ascending and descending, but this is another one of those little verbal cues that helps you connect on to the story, what's going here. And then the next thing I notice here, the spirit descending, and here, once again, I have got ace. Now, notice our English translations here have regularly translated with the spirit descending like a dove on him. Now, I would think that would be an epi, okay? And what's interesting at this point, I can quickly just switch here. I have got my Nestle Elan 28 with the that has also the text variants located here. And if I look, I can see that quite a few of the manuscripts have used epi. There's that, if you can see it right there, that ep right here that's indicated in all these manuscripts. It comes up in the majority text. So now I know why the King James Version used the epi there, because they used upon because they had epi in their text. The text we have is in Vaticanus, Pisa, and some other ones, and it's a text that it's a reading that's certainly a more difficult reading. And so I'm thinking, again here, I'm going to stick with that. And what I'm really picturing at this point is the Spirit not just sort of fluttering over Jesus's head, but it's the Spirit descending into Jesus. It's actually going into him. This is where the way I'm picturing this, and Mark's language is careful here, is Jesus is becoming possessed, in a sense, by the Holy Spirit, and he is going to be, in contrast to the other people that he's going to have unclean spirits that propel and drive them, we are going to see it's the Spirit of God that possesses Jesus. And what becomes particularly interesting at this point is, once again, if we go out to our crucifixion scene here, I'll expand our verses here a little bit more and get to Mark. And what's interesting at this point, we just had the curtain temple split, and it says then when the centurion saw that he, it says in this way, breathed his last, is what the NRSV says. But if you look at the Greek right here, what is that verb? It is ekpneo. It's expiring, which you can hear in English even is the expirating, he's expiring. So for me, this is another little verbal connection that back here in the baptism scene, the Spirit comes into Jesus, and at his death, he expires. This is a very Hebrew way of sort of thinking about this, but he's being possessed and occupied by God and going to be driven by God in that way. Okay. Let me, the other question that came up earlier that I want to highlight now then is, why do I bold the Spirit voice and the Spirit? And actually this hymn should be bolded too here. I have to update my own translation. That's because the other thing that happens in the distinction between Greek and English is that in English, we need word order in order to establish meaning. So the dog bit the boy is different than the boy bit the dog. Now with Greek, as you know, as inflectional endings, and so what happens with this is you have more flexibility in terms of word order. But the default word order in Greek should be verb, subject, and then object. So here again, I can use my little coloring code here, helps out, that I can see things here more quickly. I see here in my mark, I don't want to turn that off here. What I've got here, here's the Spirit descending into him. So the Spirit, like a dove descending into him, and the Spirit here is up in this sort of fronted, you would say it. It's put into before the verbal idea here of the participle. And so I'm trying to capture that emphasis here. And in speaking it then, all I would be able to do is that bold there is a reminder to me, and the Spirit like a dove descending into him. It's just a reminder to me to pick up the word order emphasis in the Greek and into the English as well. And so as I look ahead here in Mark 1:11, the phone, the voice, is put right up front there. So, and a voice came from the heavens. And down here again, it's the angels are the same thing as being fronted here as the subject. So that's just a way I'm using to highlight, and it's hard to do more in English translation in the written form, but when you speak it, you're able to highlight that particular aspect. Okay, did I have questions as I pause here for a second, David?
Sorry, trying to get the controls so I could unmute myself. Yes, there is one new question with the prepositions. You in, let me see here. You in your work are making an emphasis on movement and motion, which supports your idea of oral. Spirit into and throws him out, verse 12, grand motion.
Yeah, and again, notice the prepositions are helpful here too, because do you notice they're almost like stage direction cues? If you had a script that you were following, all these motion things help you indicate somewhat what the performer is doing with their hands and arms and gestures this way. It's like stage directions almost. So these prepositions help, and that's why, again, I'm trying to pay close attention to them.
Okay, I actually have a question that's come up to me. The use of euthus strikes me as functioning a lot like the hine in Hebrew. Is there a connection there? Do you think that's a Hebraism or
It
just
is.
parallel?
Well, actually, the hine is actually the idus in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So the vahine in the Hebrew comes out most often as kai idu.
Mm-hmm.
So the idu is the one that picks up. And I don't have an example of that here in this passage. That would be one thing, but that's another interesting thing that in the King James Version, they always pretty much translate it, and behold. That was the idu. In a lot of English versions, they don't even translate it, they omit it. But
Mm-hmm.
again, as a oral sort of thing, it's very important. So in my translation, I've just ended up translating it with, and look here. That's instead of using the sort of behold, I'm using, and look here. And
Right.
again, when you hear it, it sounds natural. And it is also a cue to the audience. Oh, something more important here. We've been sort of floating along. Now pay attention. So that idu is very important.
Okay. I think that's all the questions we've got. Oh, wait. Um, Someone's asking you to elaborate on the default Greek word order, verb, subject, object,
Uh-huh.
um, and said, "Did you mean Hebrew word order, not Greek?" Obviously, that's typical of Hebrew, but
It is the Greek as well, verb, subject, object. And actually then what they like to do is they'll front sort of, the background material gets fronted. So a lot of times in the Greek, the way you would do it is you stick up a bunch of participial phrases, circumstantial participles up front. And while they were doing this, and when this was happening, Jesus came, and there you got it. And in the Greek, it would be he came, ha Jesus. So verb, subject, object is also the standard default word order in Greek. So I'm paying attention to that throughout.
okay. All right, I think that's all we've got at this point. Oh,
Okay.
wait, no, every time I say that, one more appears. Euthus happens 42 times in Mark. Any thoughts on that?
Well, as I say, it is such a marker in Mark that provides a sort of, as I say, you can accompany a gesture with it, and it creates this sense of urgency, especially in the beginning, as you look at all of these piled up in the first few chapters of Mark here. It just keeps moving this story along until we get to this slowing down with this compression of time in the last chapter. So,
Right.
yeah. It's an important cue there.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. We're doing fine here on time for this. The next thing, notice I brought up here in verse 9, I brought up that attention to kai genita, and then he went straight into an indicative verb. That wasn't, it was odd here. There was no subject to that initial clause. What I do see here now in verse 11 is he's got kai genita, but this time he does supply that subject to it. And that's where that voice is going to get emphasized here. But this is another little verbal thing. If you heard that kai genita up before, Now I'm going to hear this kai ageneto again, which is going to indicate to me, oh, I've got a slight shift in what's going on in this text. And a voice came from the heavens. And here I'm going to see that the Greek says su e ho huios mu ho agapetos and soy el dokesa. The su e, now one of the things you learn in Greek, of course, here is that verbs stand all by themselves as a full sentence, because both the subject and the verbal action are embedded in the verb. So a, that means you are. So when you add the pronoun to it, the su right in front of it here, you are adding extra emphasis. Now, especially su a is a little, is one that you probably would use a su more often, just because a can be the if, or the other a could sound like ors, different things. So su a makes clear. But one of the things I'm trying to do in my translation then is every time when I come across that is to try to recognize that in my English translation. So you can see in the other ones, they just do you, thou, you, they just simply do it that way. And that's fine. In my orally here, I'm going to say you are my beloved son. So that's picking up the sort of extra emphasis that we have with that at this point. So that's just another little verbal thing that we have got going on here. Now, as I continue on, it says ha huios mu ha agapetos. And here, this is a thing that translators simply have to decide, because there is no right way on this. Agapetos is an adjective. It means, you can hear the agape, it means beloved. Makes a good sense there to do it that way. But if you look at your versions here, you'll see that you are my beloved son, but the King James, the NRSV says you are my son, the beloved. Now, what's the difference that's going on here is that the King James has taken it as an adjective describing son. The New RSV has taken that adjective and made it as a substantive, made it the beloved. Either one of these is quite possible in this way. The NIV, I'm not, they sort of get around it. You are my son whom I love. Okay, that works. The CEB tries to pick it up with whom I dearly love. All of these are actually acceptable translations. The thing here at this point, if we had more time and we'd search out here, I could use the infer command in accordance, and this would bring me, or my commentaries hopefully would bring me as well, to the story in Genesis 22, when God speaks to Abraham and he says to him, take your son, your only son, your beloved Isaac. And that's the same sort of language in here. And there are all sorts of things in early Christianity that are somehow connecting that Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac story with Jesus and his crucifixion. There's something going on here. So there's a little connection that's being made here with that. Okay, so here we've got this. And now, kai elthos, we hear this. Again, I'm going to preserve that with that and immediately. That doesn't get picked up necessarily in all of them. And the spirit, him, the auton is fronted here. That gets a little extra emphasis. And then he ekbales. And here again, I can pull up quickly. You can see how my little thing helps me remember. You see my ekbale here? I have got it. It's a gold. It's an indicative verb, and I got that little frame around it. That frame tells me that it's a historical present. Now, you'll see regularly in the commentaries and the notes, this is a technique that's used in Greek to make something more vivid. And in English, this is the thing we use all the time when we tell jokes. Three guys go into a bar. It's not that they went into a bar, but they go into a bar. And by using that present tense, we are trying to make the text more vivid. Now, the grammars regularly recognize this. This is a typical pattern in Greek. And what you can see here is they say, so it's just a way of doing it. But notice all of them are using past tense. Drove him out, sent him out, forced him out. They've turned it into a past tense because the narrative is functioning all as this sort of retrospective look at what Jesus was doing. My contention is Jesus knew Mark knew a past tense aorist from his present tense as well as anybody, and that these are intentional, again, verbal markers that you hear this, that something more dramatic is happening. So you can see here with mine, the way I regularly translate historical presents are as simple present. So it's not that the Spirit cast him out, but the Spirit casts him out. And there's a certain degree of vividness. And as I say, I'm very consistent when I try to capture those historical presents here. Now, the next thing with this that's interesting is the verb is ekbalo, okay? And this is the balo. We always like remembering that vocabulary word because you throw a ball, right? So you can throw throw out. You got that ekbalo sense. And what is it that the Spirit is actually doing here? Now here, once again, I could go through and look at, take my lexicons and look at this. I could look at my hits on this. What we would find is this is what Jesus regularly does to unclean spirits. He casts them out. And it's interesting at this point here then that Jesus, now that he has filled with the Holy Spirit, with God's Spirit, now the Spirit is driving him out. And again, there's ways that you don't translate the same word, the one word, the exact same way all the time. The context does matter, but where it can be preserved, I try to preserve that so that you hear that and at least speculate about it and think about it. So that's why I do casts him out. I think here drove him out kind of gets at it here. The NIV, to have him sent him out, I think that's just too weak. Here's again where you're making translation choices and trying to reflect the Greek as best you can. This CEB used forced him out. And again, we could be looking at other versions here. I had a few more other texts here. I got to get down to the bottom here. Oh, it's not going to let me do that. Well, here I'll pull out a few more texts this way. Get to 5 verses here, and here the New American Standard use brought him out. Okay, that just does not seem strong enough to me for that. Here the CEB, right away God's Spirit made Jesus go out. So again, you can see some variety of ways that people are translating that. Another thing that you're going to get here then is now he is en te eramo. Now here, this is my preposition en, and that is a location one. So the point is he drove him eis tein eramo, into the wilderness, and now he's in the wilderness. So this is where again I'm trying to make that distinction that I think Mark is doing between eis and en. So he was driven out into the wilderness, and now he's in the wilderness. And in some ways, this matches up here where we had he was baptized into the Jordan, and he was in those days. So these same sort of prepositions are getting repeated down here. Again, these are just little oral things that you can connect to make that going, making that connection. And then another interesting one that everybody, when you translate, you have to make a decision about it, is this verb peirazo. How do you want to translate that? And you can see here, most of our translations use tempt. He was tempted by Satan. Now, I would contend that it's actually a test instead of a tempt, and hopefully you can hear the distinction between that. When I am giving my students a test, I am not trying to tempt them into failure. I am trying to test them to determine their knowledge and capability. And this, of course, is the same word that's used in the Lord's Prayer, and lead us not into temptation is, of course, the old King James version of it. The new version of the Lord's Prayer has, and save us from the time of trial. I'm really thinking here that God tempts no one to sin. You can pick up that passage. But that we need to be tested so that our faith is refined more than gold. And so I tend to use test here, but this is again just one of those things as someone goes around and does translation work and compares translation. This is one of those decisions that you have to make. Was he tested or was he tempted? and he was tested by Satan, and I'm hearing another hupotosatana matches up here with that hupoyanu by John, by Yohanan up there, and by Satan down here. So I've got that going on. And he was with the therion. Now here you can use wild beasts or wild animals. I went with beasts. If you look up this word, this is a very interesting word to look up. So I'm going to have to reduce down here. And if I go to this therion here, there we go. And I'm getting my lexicon lookup. And here's where, now the BDAG is that standard dictionary. A new resource that Accordance has just come out with is this Brill dictionary, which brings us more into more of the classical. It overlaps a little bit more with that. And what's interesting here is now if I go to that, you will see here, there's all these words here, and this is the word, this therion is the word that has to do with fighting with wild beasts. Now, Paul is going to use that language, right, where he talks about, was I fighting with wild beasts in Ephesus? But we're seeing here, this is the language of the Colosseum and the amphitheaters where they've got these gladiator fights of fighting with wild beasts here. And I'm thinking especially of Mark's community, if indeed it is from Rome, which makes a very good thing. They certainly would have been familiar with people fighting wild animals in the Colosseum there. And so again, this is a little detail. I like to use beasts. It sounds like more Colosseum language to me here, but it also reminds us this then is not a picture of Jesus like Francis of Assisi with all the beasts and animals coming peacefully around him, but these are threatening sort of beasts that are threatening him. And what happens? The angels are diaconing. There are deaconing, ministering, serving him. And this is another kind of word that you could look at and do a word study of this, and you will see who diakos, Jesus here. So I'm going to search for the lexeme, and I'm just going to keep it to Mark here so we can thin this out a little bit. And we see here the angels are serving Jesus here. And here's now again where I would use the same word so that a person in Greek who hears this word being repeated would also hear it in English. Here now, Peter Simon's mother-in-law, she serves. And then we've got 10:45 where the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And so that's interesting here that the first two instances of the word are where Jesus is being served by someone else, and now he's going to be served. And then we find it one more time, it refers to the women who had been serving Jesus all along. This is just one of those things that when you pay attention to that kind of language here, you see, oh, who serves Jesus? Angels and women. Okay, so there's something neat about that. And then you also sort of see this business here that ultimately Jesus identifies with those women in a sense when he takes on that service role as well here. Okay, so this is the way then that I've worked through a translation. And again, I could show you more sort of the ways that I've tried to highlight all these different things here. And if you download my handout, you can follow along a little more closely and pick up a few things that I skipped over here. I mentioned the sound about here, the akainais, tes, hemerais, da galileas. There's that sort of euphony that we get here. The last one isn't perfect, but it gets to it. And then this business that we saw with the coming with the immediately, he saw, Aden, schizomenus tus uranus. You hear that us. Again, these are sort of memorable things that stick in your mind in the Greek. These now are almost impossible to get into English. And then once I've done this translation, when I'm getting ready to perform a text, what I do then is I line it out something like this, looking at the Greek grammatical structure. So I have got all the main verb clauses aligned to the left here, and then I indent any subordinate clauses or ones that are complementary in some way. And then what I do is I try to start highlighting so that I can see what's going on here. So that agenital, I had noticed it happened in both 9 and 11, and I was tempted to go, and a voice happened from the heavens. That might even be a way I'll end up with that. A voice happened. Probably it sounds like it could work there. So I noticed that kai agenital that happened both of those. And then I noticed that preposition in those days within the wilderness 40 days. So there's a nice paralleling here. And here was the into the Jordan, into him, and into the wilderness. 3 ace prepositions that are going on here. The kai altos them, and immediately that connects here together. And then ascending from the waters, and then the descending and the voice from the heavens. So I've got these things are all going on here. And for me, and then by John and by Satan, all of these are ways that link this whole thing up and help me both to see the text as it appears in the Greek and to hear it. So let me try again. And I had told you the NIV the first time, but listen now to, and again, just listen to my translation and see if it sounds fine. So this is Mark 1, 9 to 13. And so it happened in those days. Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized into the Jordan by John. And immediately, as he was ascending from the water, he saw the heavens being ripped apart, and the Spirit like a dove descending into him. And a voice happened from the heavens. You are my beloved Son. With you I am so delighted. And immediately the Spirit cast him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days while being tested by Satan, and he was in the midst of wild beasts, and the angels were serving him. Okay, that's what I've got here, and I wanted to leave some more time for questions, and I'd be interested partly just to see how you mix my metaphors, to see if you heard a difference and if this way of translating is helpful, and if you can see why I'm doing what I'm doing, especially in light of the Greek and in comparison to other translations.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hoffman. Let's go through some of these. If Mark is very much an oral performance, how do the other Gospels compare with each other? In that oral to literary, I guess, kind of spectrum. Is there a general order between the 4?
Okay, so that's a great question. And my opinion is Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and this, I think it's undeniable that they used Mark, and I think almost all scholars would agree with that too here. So on my little handout, I actually didn't know if I'd have time to it. I'm calling it the literaryization of Mark by Matthew and Luke. And my understanding is both of them saw Mark, they heard the Greek in it, and they said, this is not good Greek. We are going to fix this up. And so they come along and they are going to do it. So I've lined out even just here my little passage right here. And it turns out Matthew he's actually added this whole little extra bit in here about why Jesus should be baptized in the first place. So he's got that. But if you overlook that, Matthew actually cleans up. So that business about kai agenital followed by the aelthen that we saw was kind of awkward up here. Matthew cleans that up. Then Jesus appeared arrived from Galilee at the Jordan to John to be baptized by him. It's now a good Greek sentence here, period, right? As you work through this, Matthew preserves Mark's 5 sentences here. He's still got some of the kais in here, but he's reduced the number of kais, so it doesn't sound quite so bad that way. He's added a nice little edu here that he is going to get here that he brings in. But when we look at Luke, I highlighted that a little bit before. Luke, this whole thing is one sentence in Luke. And what he's done then is he has taken that opening agenital, and that indicative verb then is going to control a whole slew of either participles or of other infinitives. And to use followed by the agenital followed by infinitives is actually kind of a classical way of doing Greek. And to have this long sentence, this is sort of demonstrating how eloquent that Luke is. So in terms of grammar, Mark is the one that's closest to oral. Matthew cleans it up and Luke makes it eloquent. That'd be sort of the way that I generalize them. And John is sort of in a whole nother category. It's more that stream of consciousness. There's actually some very nice Greek in there. He tends to use kai or use the des, and so he'll use paratactic style, but clearly the Mark is the most paratactic and Luke is the most hupotactic, using the fancier Greek as he goes along here. So that was, and Luke, notice here also, I counted here, Mark takes 53 words to tell the sentence. Luke does it in 43. So he's just tidying this whole thing up, and the English teacher, the Greek grammar teacher, gives him an A compared to Mark.
Yep. Yeah. By the way, on that, on the classical, note, I took great satisfaction that you pronounced euthus as euthus instead of euthus or something like that, because I first took classical Greek and learned to pronounce it that way, and then got to seminary and everybody was U-ing the epsilon, upsilon, and it just sounded wrong to my ear. So I guess Luke is sort of doing the same thing for his audience.
Well, I've got a problem now. I'm doing Duolingo. I'm learning modern Greek, and it's F,
F, yeah.
In the modern Greek. So I'm confusing myself more and more. So I'm sort of ending in between. So yeah, excuse my pronunciation where I do go off. Thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions there?
In Mark 1:13, why serving him? Couldn't the dative be serving with him? Thus, the angels didn't show up at the end, but were there all the time?
Okay, so the diakoneo, this would be the thing I would check up here, and I'm the auto and the dative here, I'm just taking as an indirect object. They were serving food would be a direct object to him. So the dative sometimes can be a dative accompaniment like that, but I think this is just the indirect object. They were serving him. And I don't know that, Mark's account of this is so abbreviated. We get the longer versions of it in Matthew and Luke, who take that one verse now and are going to make it those longer stories. I don't have a clear sense of the time in this era of that he got tested first and then he got served, or whether they were going over together. I'm not sure about that.
Okay. There's a question, does his version include the Old Testament? I'm assuming that's your translation.
I'm just working on Mark. I've got most of Mark translated, and actually what I'm working on then is it's a translation, a commentary on translating. So the UBS Translator's Handbook, I noted that earlier, and the ways that they try to do it, but that's translating for other languages other than English. That SIL and the exegetical Greek ones, they are trying to highlight some of the same things I did. But I'm mainly doing this with Mark because it's an oral one, so I'm doing a translation with the commentary on why I'm translating the way I'm doing, and then I'm also providing a performance guide, I'm calling it. I don't know if many of you have seen this. This has, especially as I mentioned earlier, the network of biblical storytellers, people who tell the biblical text. This isn't making up stories or making up stories that are related to the Bible, but are really trying to tell the text, and recognizing that all of this is, that those early Christians must have been familiar with all the theaters. You go into any Greco-Roman city in the first century, and there's a theater or a little Odeon or something there. And people, that was main forms of entertainment. You see these huge theaters in each city, and they would have been accustomed then to people performing. And I'm thinking that when they gather in their little house churches, the model they have in their mind is coming from those theaters, and they are familiar with people performing the text. So Mark is recording this performance. Matthew and Luke are turning it into literary works in a different way. But the performance then, and here now, if we had more video, I suppose I could do this with a video here. I've got this one pretty much memorized. I would have, you heard me hopefully like snapping my fingers with the immediately, the gesturing for the ascending and descending, casting out into the wilderness. All of these have gestures with them that someone had noted earlier there with all these prepositions. They're giving all these directions. There's a lot of movement in this. And the thing I would like to highlight, though, when I talk about performing the text, I am not acting. And the distinction I'm making is that when you act, you pretend that the audience isn't there, right? And you're up there on the stage and you're dramatizing something. The performance is intentionally engaging with the audience. You're really trying to invite them into a participation into the story. You're trying to draw them into the story so that they are with you. So one of the even memorization techniques that I tend to use is it's not so much memorizing the words, but learning it by heart, so that when it comes to telling the story, it's almost as if I have a video running in my head and I am simply describing what I'm seeing, and I'm sharing that with the audience who sees it with me. So that's what I'm doing with this, and I'm happy if I can get through Mark. I am not Eugene Peterson. How he managed that, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked about when you did your performance at the end, you used John rather than Yohanan. Why'd you do that?
Because I was going too fast.
Okay. You got
I should also say my translation is. What's been interesting in this translation project that I'm doing is that as I've gotten through Mark, the further I go in, the more I have to go back to the beginning and sort of get it in line, because I'm discovering all these sort of connections in the Gospel of Mark that I've never noticed before until I've started doing this. And so once I come across something later, I go, oh, I need to make sure that I connect this with what's earlier. So this was like version 6.1 or something like that, and I'm at like version 7.3 now or something. So I keep updating that as I go along. And maybe here, one other thing I wanted to mention, this good reminded me here. So what I have done is, this is my translation here that I've imported into Accordance. This is a great thing that they allow you to do. I'm trusting you still see my Accordance screen here. What you can do with Accordance is go to File, User Files, and you can import a Bible text. It'll give you the warning here. And what I have done out, I don't have it right here. Let me see, I can maybe pull it up for you. I'm going to get my screen up here. I'll flip it over. What I've done out on the forum is I've given you a little template. There's a certain abbreviation code that's needed for each book of the Bible, and a certain way that they have to be set up. They use the text format. So if you look at this, you'll see where you can paste in verse by verse. You have to go, for now at least. If you have your own translation that you're working on, paste in verse by verse using this initial template right here. You'll see it looks like I actually did it for the whole Bible here, but it goes down. There's your text here. So you would have to just paste in verse by verse, and then you can import that, as I just showed there, and create your own version. So that's why I have this showing up in Accordance. Not one of the other nice features of Accordance.
Okay. You got a really nice on your reading, and then someone asked, you mentioned tested by God is appropriate, um, yet your text says tested by Satan. I wonder if there are other tested by Satan references.
So what I maybe misspoke there, I'm not sure. What I was referring to is that passage, is it Second Peter that it says God tempts no one,
Right.
but it talks about that our faith needs to be tested and refined like gold is the sort of deal there. So that's what I'm saying. I in English, I hear the distinction between test and tempt. And the way I understand it is that our faith is oftentimes tested, which I even hear in the Lord's Prayer there that, Lord, save us from these tests. We don't like these tests. They're no fun, Allah, but we count on you to preserve us ultimately from evil. So it's a recognition that the testing is in some way necessary. And that's what I'm seeing here is why I chose to use that with Jesus at this point here, as his identity as God's son is being tested. And even if you look in the Matthew and Luke versions, I think they're not tempting. He wasn't tempted to eat bread. He was tested to see whether he would use his powers to turn stones into bread. He wasn't tempted to jump off the temple, but he was being tested if he was going to use his powers to make a, well, I don't want to say make a splash. That wouldn't be the right demonstration of his power by that. So that's why, but again, that's a translation lexical choice. And those are the kind of things. And when I see here, this is where when I would come at this, I want to look at all the other times where peirazo is used in Mark and see, is it regularly used that way that I can use the same word or not? So actually, and here I can maybe, I've been constructing a little thing here. This isn't totally done here either, but this is, I'm going along. This is sort of my equivalencies where I'm trying to pull together every time I translate epitimao. I'm going to use one of those words there. When the elthos, I'm using immediately, zeteo, search, seek, and you've got all these different words that sometimes overlap, like thambeo is to astonish and thambazo is to amaze. Again, this is, you can't use the same word every time in translation, but as much as possible, I'm trying to do so that English hearers hear what a Greek hearer would have heard.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You had mentioned kind of in passing paratactic versus hypotactic. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, thank you. I should be clear. The paratactic, that means you just connect independent clauses together. So this is the and this, and this, and this, and this. Hypotactic is the hupo, where you're subordinating, undering things, subordinating things. And so you've got a main idea with all sorts of subordinating things. While we were doing this, under the circumstances of this, as this was happening, we went to the store. And that's why, as I showed there, Luke makes this whole thing one whole sentence instead of 5. He takes 5 independent clauses in Mark and turns them into one. And so there's a very clear demonstration of the distinction between paratactic Mark and hypotactic Luke.
Okay, thank you. By the way, I think Bert did a quick accordance search, or maybe he's got it memorized. It's James 1:13. When tempted, no one should say God is tempting.
There we go. Thank you. James 1:13. Bert's always good on these. He's always helpful on that.
Yeah. How does Mark relate to the other languages such as Aramaic or Hebrew? I'm not quite sure. I guess asking about the Aramaic or Hebrew character of Mark, sort of like Matthew.
So this is a good, this is one of those big questions you have to ask, because what languages Jesus spoke is hotly contested. Of course, Jesus could speak any language, but what was he speaking while he was in Galilee there? The studies show that predominantly, I'm guessing he spoke Aramaic, and we see that little traces of it where every once in a while, you know, the Talitha Kum and other, the cry from the cross seems to be Aramaic. So that would seem to be, and most of our evidence would seem to indicate, that would be the language that most Jews in Galilee would have been speaking. Now, if they'd had any training and if they were hearing any scripture read, they might pick up some Hebrew as well. But this was all part of the Roman Empire now that was speaking Greek, doing some transitioning to Latin. And so the speculation is, and the likelihood is, that even a Jewish fisherman would know some Greek in order to be able to function in the marketplaces. So to what degree did Jesus know Greek? It's not sure. I'm imagining that most of what Jesus said, if we take the direct quotations of Jesus out, were probably spoken in Aramaic. But as the stories were told, as soon as you got out of Aramaic, you were 1 degree separation there. And there's going to be times, like, you know, some of these things I've highlighted, that they can still pick up a little bit from the Septuagint Greek that's trying to replicate the Hebrew in some ways. So you're going to hear some of that that's in there. But otherwise, Mark, I think, is clearly, it was never a Aramaic document that was translated into Greek. This was always a Greek document.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. In his commentary on the Gospel of Mark in the Phillips commentary series, James Edwards says that the Gospel of Mark was frequently overlooked by the church fathers who preferred to cite from Matthew and Luke and rarely commented on Mark. Did the early church miss the oral quality of Mark? Are there early church witnesses that comment on this quality?
So that's another great question, and I think explains a bunch of things. First of all, Mark sort of got pushed to the side because I think it's like 86% of Mark is in either Matthew or Luke, and the other percent that isn't in the other ones is sometimes kind of strange things. The naked man running away in the garden and other little details like that. So for one, if you have Matthew, you really, I mean, on one hand, you'd say, well, I don't need Mark. If I got Matthew and if I've got Luke, I don't need Mark. So Mark was sort of treated as like the Reader's Digest version in some sense that way. So that was why, for one, it could get overlooked. And secondly, it was overlooked partly because there was value added as Christianity's trying to establish itself as a reputable religion, a faith here, as a reputable expression of Judaism, that you would go with a little bit better Greek. So, you know, if you were going to share this with somebody that you were trying to share the gospel with, somebody that you were trying to impress, Mark would be that would be handing them, you know, a sort of child's book instead. If we wanted to impress them, I'd give them Luke, right? So I think that's partly why that came out. But on the other hand, remember then too, according to tradition, and it's got a decent likelihood, Mark was understood to be the translator of Peter. So Mark is always doing this orally initially here, if we understand that tradition functioning at all here. So this was this sort of early oral sort of rendering of the gospel, and as I say, Matthew and Luke come along and fix it up. So I think the early church was aware of the oral character of it, but that wasn't as valued as the nice literary characteristics and the fuller works of Matthew and Luke.
Okay. Someone writes, I liked your thought on wild beasts, but it's also used in Revelation. Could there be apocalyptic overtones?
See, now that's another good idea here with this. And I see now here, though, I'm going to Mark 13, and I don't have wild beasts in Mark 13. So if you knew Revelation, sorry, that might make a link.
Okay. Let's see. I've been reading Mark as Story by David Rhodes, and I'm fascinated by techniques such as Markan sandwiches. Are you familiar with this book? Do you have a time frame when you might make your work available.
Oh, okay. So first of all, the time frame, my goal is to have this. I've got a little bit of a sabbatical coming in the revised common lectionary, which some of you may be using. We're in year C right now, and so in 2 years we'll be back to year B, which is the year of Mark. So that's to have this all ready to go by the year B. So in 2 years to have this ready for in less than 2 years then. So that's a time frame. David Rhodes, I know David is a wonderful person, and actually this is one of these funny stories. This was way back in 1976. I was taking Greek at the University of Illinois. Vernon Robbins was my professor, and he said, I have a friend who's working on this thing on Mark, and let's take a look at his translation as we do work in Greek. I discovered later that was David Rhodes' translation that ended up in his book, Marcus Story, which has now gone into multiple editions of it there. And he has an interesting, that's a great point. Marcus Story, he's the one that really highlighted the narrative aspect of this. Now, since then, David Rhodes, Tom Boomershine, number of others have tried to go more, picked up the oral characteristic, but they go hand in hand. The narrative techniques are the things that make the oral possibilities, help the oral nature of it. So you mentioned the intercalations, the sandwich stories there. Now, what those are nice little frames that help the speaker sort of frame the picture in their head. The example of this is if you picture the Greek temples, right? They have the little triangle there up above the front door, and they actually tell a story. And do you notice those are those sort of, the things on the ends form the frames for the main thing, which is in the middle. And that's the same thing that happens literarily. And so with my little depiction that I had there, there's some sense you can see even in this story right here, you've got sort of parallels here and here are going, right? And you've got a little bit of the immediatelys that are going here. And what this means is this is our important point right here. And especially this saying. So if you can picture these things, and again, that's why I sort of color code them. It helps me just when I'm trying to remember the story to sort of see the colors. These framing techniques, these intercalations, these sandwiches, they're a narrative technique that point towards the important part. They function well to help the hearer tell the story, and they function well for the speaker to tell the story and for the hearer to catch the important points of the story. And they make nice little units then that you sort of remember your units then as you go along. That's a great question.
You had, I think when you were paralleling showing the litericization of Mark, you showed how Luke was the most concise in that case, in the Greek. So the question is Luke the most concise in his Greek? How do Matthew and Mark compare with each other?
Yeah, so it's interesting to try to do that, and I haven't done a full study on that. One of the things that happens is people looking, and this gets into the whole synoptic problem at this point, and I will confess that more and more I've become persuaded by the Farrer hypothesis that Luke not only used Mark, but Luke also used Matthew. It allows us to get rid of that whole Q hypothetical document that way. There's just a lot of things that make sense to me. So I'm playing around with that, and that's Mark Goodacre's work that way. What I do see is Luke tends to be the most clear for the most part. It isn't necessarily always that he's going to be the concise, but he is, I think, is the clearest in what he's trying to say here. He hasn't got quite the same interests that Matthew does. Matthew, of course, I think really comes out of a Jewish Christian community, and so there's a lot more of the emphasis on scriptural sort of things there that he does that way. When Luke does it, he's being very intentional about it. So those agenita de, That's something actually Luke uses, and my sense is he knows that's not good Greek, but he's trying to sound like the Hebrew. He's trying to sound like the Septuagint Bible that they were all using. So he sort of, in some ways, resorts to King James Greek every once in a while. But the other thing that I find on these, they call it editorial fatigue. It's like, okay, you're using a source and you're being all creative and you're really improving it. And after a while, you just get tired and you just start sort of copying it. And so there's a variation, I'm thinking, on whether he was having late in the day or early in the day or later in the struggles or not. So my sense, I'd have to do more work, but my sense there's a certain amount of inconsistency, but in general, Luke is doing the best job of cleaning it all up.